Business bankruptcies booming. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, welcome back Branko, who's been completing a bit of a deep dive into the financial situation of small businesses in the US and the flow-on compounding consequences that a series of bankruptcies may have on the markets more broadly. So how are you going today, Branko?
Good, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Keen for today's discussion.
Yeah, you were looking at it today, sort of digging into the weeds a little bit on what's going on specifically with small businesses, and that's not something we have touched on it before. You've mentioned it before, but it is probably like it is in Australia, the sort of the base of the economy, the biggest employer. It is an important area of the economy to be focused on. So, can you give us that big picture overview of what the current state is for those small businesses that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so the reason I want to talk about this today was because basically there was some data that came out from the American Bankruptcy Institute that was just saying that we've already had as many small business bankruptcies in the US through 9 months than we had through all of last year,
Right.
which is quite a big difference. And then if you look at some of the data, I can put the graph up on the screen, it's pretty clear that since the pandemic, it's been quite steadily increasing. So I think this is something I just wanted to talk about and monitor because I think there's a lot of flow-on effects that can come from these small businesses, potentially going under, or as we've seen, close to 1,500 already this year in the US that have gone under. And I would also say that a lot of small business owners are very pessimistic about the economy, which is going to negatively impact their ability to expand and take on risk as well. There were some surveys that came out where basically half of the respondents said that the country's already in a recession and or approaching a recession. So it's a combination of factors that could negatively affect the economy focused on small business.
And just on those surveys, I really find those to be some of the more relevant surveys because when you're talking to small business owners, they are the boots on the ground. They're not economists in ivory towers sort of judging what they think is happening. They're the people that are really seeing it with customers coming into their stores or whatever their business might be. So you could probably give a little bit more credibility to their data than other sources, really.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you said that. I'll specify the exact data I'm talking about. So it was an index tracking small business owners' confidence,
Yep.
and they surveyed about 750 small businesses, and 52% believe that they're in a recession or approaching a recession. And that obviously is going to affect the way they, approach their business. So I think it's
Yes.
quite an interesting discussion.
And a very important point because that does impact their decisions that they make going forward about hiring, about stocks, how much they're going to stock up on things. It all rolls in. So what do you see as some of the key factors that are actually driving this? What's leading us to this situation?
Yeah, so like I said, there is quite a significant increase in bankruptcies. I think the main drivers are a lot of the stuff that we've kind of discussed on the show continuously, which are rising interest rates, tighter bank credit. So because of the Silicon Valley bank collapse, banks kind of have to, put on stricter credit limits and things of this nature. Um, and then also some businesses are very over leveraged as well. And then one that is very America specific is surging wages, particularly in California, with a significant increase in minimum wage. Obviously, that disproportionately affects small business owners. So they're just some of the overall kind of factors affecting this. So it'll be interesting to see how those play out over the coming few months.
Yeah, and even when we talk about the US is an interesting one, but when we talk about interest rates as one of those that you're sort of mentioning, that's really interesting there because the US often their home loan rates are not the same impact that ours are because we're on the variable rates there on those longer term, generally on long term mortgages that can be 30 years or so. So it doesn't impact directly. But for businesses, the flow on will be quite immediate, you would imagine, because those interest rates will have more of a direct impact than personal home loans would for the average consumer.
Yeah, that's a great point. The difference between Australian and American kind of interest rate environment in that sense.
Yeah, because it is that lagged flow, but not necessarily for small businesses. So what do you think that the potential flow on is then? So if we're starting to see this increase in bankruptcies and it is broadly occurring across various industries. Like from the data that you're sort of looking at there, it's quite broad and a little bit concerning. How does this flow on? What do you see as the next steps in this process?
Yeah. So one quick point I actually want to make is I saw this bankruptcy attorney in Nashville called Robert Gonzalez, and he was saying that the past like a few months, he's seen 4 times as many calls discussing bankruptcy than he's seen like ever before. So this is a growing concern. And then if more people are discussing bankruptcy, obviously more likely might have to go bankrupt. And the biggest flow-on effect, I think, is going to be the impact on small regional banks, and because they're the ones that often give these smaller loans to entrepreneurs and small businesses, they're going to be affected if these small businesses go under. And the kind of key point with that is obviously these smaller banks aren't exactly the most liquid or the most stable from a capital perspective. So that could potentially start a smaller bank run. And as we discussed in the past, a lot of these mid-tier and smaller regional banks have recently had a bunch of credit downgrades as well. So when you combine that information with some more macroeconomic data showing that small business is declining, it can be concerning for these smaller banks.
And there's a lot to factor in to that discussion around those smaller banks, because we've already seen the impact of these elevated bond yields, and that's something that is a bit complex, but we've talked about a few times that it really squeezes those banks, and then they're not in the position to sort of effectively bail themselves out like some of the big banks have been able to. So then it ends up potentially flowing on into acquisitions by the bigger banks, and you end up with monopolies in these big banks that take over small ones. But if you're thinking about that, that's a really interesting sort of angle to look down, because part of the reason that small businesses rely so heavily on these small regional banks is because they offer services tailored to their specific community or their specific needs. And I mean, I think we all know this, at least anecdotally here. If if you're going in and want to do something a little bit different to the norm, you need to speak to someone for them to understand what you actually want to do. And we know what it's like with the big banks. Trying to get a meeting or trying to get a sit-down discussion can be a very difficult thing to achieve. So you need that local branch, that local manager that understands your business, understands what you're trying to do. So that could be a compounded factor here for sure.
Yeah, and I think to add to that point, as I'm sure we're both aware, I think in Australia as well, smaller banks, their risk profile is probably a bit higher. So they're willing to take on clients that might have activities that the banks don't like, such as selling or buying bullion, selling or buying crypto, for example. So I think the profile of these smaller banks is generally going to have more of these smaller businesses that in America are more of a risk at the moment.
Yeah. And it was actually, I wish I read it a little bit more closely, but there was some data that, or I don't know if it was a leaked memo or what it was, I saw in the news in the last 24 hours from the RBA, a point that you made before about they were getting a lot of calls. So here they were talking about people even on 6-figure salaries who were effectively calling for assistance, financial advice, financial assistance from the support services. That was something that was really flagging to the RBA, because it was a massive uptick. And that's similar to what you were just saying before about what's happening with these small businesses in the US. I think that why that data is so important to look at on the ground level, because they're really feeling the squeeze, even those, in the case of Australia, it was people who traditionally aren't the ones that would have been the first to require assistance now are probably the same with those small businesses in the US.
Yeah, I think as well, things like just like people making phone calls, as kind of silly as it may sound, is often, I think, a better indicator of what is going on in the real world than some of the traditional data that we get, like GDP figures and things like that. Like, it just shows what people are really going through, what is the demand of people calling up and asking for help, in these situations. And that is quite high. So I think that is almost a stronger indicator of where we are in an economy than a lot of other more formal indicators. So.
And I think one last bit I would add to that is the point you made a little while ago there about these decisions being made by the small business owners having lagging effects too, because if you're a big business, you may be able to hire a lot of people, fire a lot of people, like that might be part of your day-to-day. If you're a small business and you get rid of some staff, you may not be able to get them back for a long period of time. Like it can actually be quite challenging to do that. So when they make a decision, it can have long-lasting impacts for that business because they have to restructure everything that they do. And this is trying to avoid bankruptcies. Obviously, you're speaking about bankruptcies as being a key part of the data there, but these impacts can last for quite a long time. It can actually take much longer to rebuild than it is to shut it down, is what I'm trying to say.
That's a great point, especially when you consider the current employment market that we're in, where there is kind of like not enough employees in the marketplace in Australia and in America as well. So if they do have to restructure, they can't just go out and find the right talent straight away. It actually is going to take a lot longer than usual. And that would obviously be detrimental for some of these businesses that need people, as soon as possible.
Yeah, and they got to build it all up again from scratch. So yeah, a big challenge. Well, Branko, thank you for that deep dive today. It's one that I think probably people can relate to a little bit because we all sort of understand that, times are quite difficult, particularly for people trying to run businesses at the moment. So that data is something that we'll definitely need to keep an eye on. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Chris. I'll see you next time. Awesome.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone for watching. Remember, reach out with any questions or comments on those social platforms. That's us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with Alex to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great rest of the day.